obscure world of parking. We use it every day, but have we really capitalized on the intricacies of our industry? In this podcast, the Parking Network will go behind the scenes and talk to industry professionals about all things parking, from the horizon of evolving technology and even stories of the old days. We hope to encourage and inspire operators and property managers alike to look at parking through a new lens.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the newest episode of our Parking Industry Podcast. Today, I'm here with Clyde Wilson, and my name is Leigh Thomas, and we are debriefing the released episode 2 weeks ago. You might have listened to our interview with Rick West, and that interview was so packed full of information. I hope you listened to it. But today, Clyde and I are just going to be chatting about the things that we heard in that interview. That conversation was just so big. Rick just has a really unique perspective about the parking industry, and he has a really high level, broad knowledge of so many components of our industry.
You know, I've known Rick for a long time, and it's been a very interesting 25 years plus knowing Rick. And I know a lot about his background, which we discussed early on in this podcast. And kind of because of my background, it was kind of easy for me to evaluate his background. And, you know, he came from the very roots of the business. His father was in the parking business. And so he kind of stayed in the family business. But then he was in New York. And, you know, for those of you who have never really managed parking in New York, you learn a more there maybe than anywhere. It's a tough business in New York. So he starts as a very young person in New York. Comes up through, then moves over to Off Airport, that I have always found as a very interesting part of our industry, that know the industry differently, but they also know they're part of it really well. So he came through that, then got into work with capital companies, took a very broad look at the industry through getting onto boards. Like he was on the board at Central Parking when they bought the Parking Network's Focus program. So I really got to spend time with Rick then and got to know him very well and got to really understand his view of the parking industry. So it was terribly interesting. So when you put Rick on a podcast, you have to be ready for great information and mainly that very good, powerful view of our industry. So it was interesting. I was so glad we were able to get him to come on to our podcast, because I knew we would have a lot to share with the industry. And our podcast has always been about not so much the people that are on the podcast, but the knowledge that they bring to us. Our job is to share with the industry, and it's great when you have people like this because you have a lot to share. So it was very interesting having Rick on, and we got to the end of that podcast and said, wow, there was a lot there, and how do we ever get all of this out to the industry? We also told him that we were absolutely sure that we would have to have another podcast just to kind of pick up where this one left off and cover some of the many topics that we just didn't have time to cover in this one.
I agree. Let's definitely do that. And one of the things that he mentioned a few times is how hard things have happened in the globe and in our country that have affected the parking industry. He specifically mentioned events like 9/11 and the recession and then COVID. But the idea that came from that part of his conversation was that hard things give us an opportunity to refocus and be better.
You know, that's a great statement, because I was just on the phone just 3 or 4 hours ago with one of the national parking companies having a similar discussion. And Rick's right. I hadn't really thought about it the way he just described it, because we lived through it and we got through it and survived all this stuff. But 11 changed a lot. And the parking industry went through tough times with it, came out the other side, starting to become more focused on efficiency, something that we really hadn't had to do before. We just had to get the cars off the street. And the money in the bank. Cars off the street, money in the bank. We were very focused on that. And all of a sudden, efficiency and information and a change in the customer's demands crept in after 9/11. And then you move forward 20 years, COVID hits. That changes our industry completely, changes the relationship of the parking company with their clients. It changes the relationship of the parking companies with their customers, and then starts demanding that we can do things that we really weren't prepared to do. When you start managing a disaster like COVID, you better have the information you need to manage it. And that's where Rick was implying there. It changed the way we look at our business day to day. And the people who understood that change came out the other side pretty well. The people who didn't come out the other side so well. So those were really big. And then we had the one that he mentioned, but we didn't talk a lot about. It certainly was impacted our type of business, downturn of 2008 and 9, where I don't know that not everybody out there felt it as much, but the parking industry did. And the parking industry is funny. For us, for the parking network at that particular time, it was a challenge because people don't tend, in hard economic times, when you're an audit company and a consulting company, you don't get hired a lot because everybody's saving every dollar they have to get to the other side of this. And then all of a sudden you're overwhelmed with work. And I remember working with Monroe Carroll, and I remember looking at some of the other companies in the parking industry during 2000 or 1980s and 90s, where we went through some of those cycles. And I remember very well when we went through a bad economic cycle, Monroe Carroll took off. He understood that you guys may be in a downturn, but we're in an upturn. This is an opportunity to grow while everybody's struggling. And he did it. And then I saw other parking companies out there that as soon as we would go through economic battles, they would pull back. They would stop traveling. They would stop meeting with their clients. They would stop spending money on their locations. They would just pull back to try to wait out the recession. Monroe very quietly, but I worked in the corporate office, so I saw things a little differently. Monroe very quietly went right out there, and he outgrew everybody. Just flat outgrew everybody in the industry in the way he looked at problems. So these problems are happening. I don't want to see it happen, but there's another one out there looming somewhere, and it will happen. So to learn how to deal with those, it's good for us to talk about them now. And Rick certainly brought them up, and I thought that was very powerful in his understanding of how those things affect the industry and really get us to where we are today. Both of those three things, 9/11, economic downturn of 98, 99, COVID, changed our industry a lot.
But it's definitely a different perspective on suffering and challenges. We can either, like Monroe Carroll did, say, okay, bring it on, let's do better, or we can be afraid. So that's something for all of us to think about, I think.
Yeah, no, I think it is. And it's because there are these things, just another economic downturn or another crisis is likely to come. How big of an impact it is, who knows? The 9/11 was a bigger impact for us, of course, than for the industry, for the U.S., than for everybody else. But the world was impacted by it. There's no question about it. And so you have to have people in the industry and people in the companies that are ready to step up to the plate with these things. So I think the short part of this podcast is we have a company, Reimagine Parking, that has been struggling since its inception. And a different sort of manager is about to take over at the top of this. And we are going to see, I don't think there's any question, we're going to see a difference in how this moves forward. And you know what? It's going to be a positive impact for all of us. I thought a lot about that before coming into this podcast where we discuss it. I think the other parking companies shouldn't be concerned about this. It's really just a part of challenging everybody to be better and better and better. And I certainly think we're going to see that happen. I don't have any question about that. With the things that Rick tries to do to reimagine, get control of it, and then move it forward and make it into the company that it's perfectly capable of being, is going to impact all of the other big and smaller companies out there as they try to stay competitive. And they will. I don't have any question that they will. But there'll be some changes.
No doubt. I think that Rick in this position gives the parking industry not only the why of to do better, but also the how. And maybe him taking this leadership role will give other facilities an idea of how to move forward. Because Rick has a lot of great ideas. He spent quite a bit of time talking about how marketing is something that's really important to him and something that he values a lot in the growth of a company. Clyde, what did you think about his stance on marketing?
Well, you've been heavily involved in a bunch of audits that we've been doing recently. And, I was having this conversation with Krista the other day about Rick and him bringing this up and about what we've seen in the audits that we've been doing more recently. And, marketing was always, from day one of the chapters in our audits. All of a sudden, that chapter may have moved up toward the front of the audit because we've seen it from the audits that we've been doing, understands it better than most people, I think, in the parking industry do. And he's going to have an impact on how his company presents the positive impacts of marketing. And we've certainly seen it in the audits that we've been doing. Marketing was just not being done. And then when we started talking about it, they almost had trouble understanding how to talk to us about it. And I can assure you that I think they've learned. So that's going to change. And they are going to have to change because Rick's going to come in with marketing plans that these guys have never competed against before. He really understands the importance of marketing in this business. And, that's really a focus. I went back and I had to go back and think about this. He brought it up. He understood it. We've certainly seen it. It's always been in our marketing plan, but COVID changed that because when all of a sudden 90% of the cars in your garage go away and you've got to tell your client, you need to keep paying us because we're doing something, you better figure out a marketing plan to bring a few more cars over into the garage. So all of a sudden the parking companies, for the most part, and people like Rick, who was in the middle of the Millennium garages, figured it out. How important this was. It's not only now just a line item of something we have to do. It's very, very important how we do it. When I sold Focus Point to Central Parking, and since I can talk about them because they're not here anymore, one of our big clients was in Seattle with a bunch of locations in Seattle, and the senior manager in Central Parking at that time was just a good regional manager, and he was fine. But the client was used to dealing with the parking network and Focus Point. So all of a sudden, when they took it over, marketing stuff. And she called me one day and said, okay, you've done this. You've brought this company in. They're not marketing. They just lost an opportunity to bring 50 cars over into the garage over here. I want you in Seattle tomorrow. So I said, okay, you're welcome. And so I go to Seattle, and she had every building manager of our portfolio in her office. She in one of their offices. She was not from Seattle. She was in Los Angeles. And I made sure that the manager from Central came to the meeting. I wanted him to hear it because I knew she had orchestrated this just as a show. So we went through this horrible 1-hour meeting of them telling me all of a sudden what a rotten crap I was because I'm not doing the marketing that needed to be done. And I made him watch me take this. And of course, this was all a setup. She knew exactly what she was doing, and she knew I knew what she was doing. And you know what? They totally failed. They never figured it out. That was a parking company in 2008, 9. Oh, I'm sorry, 2010. They never figured it out. We ended up having to step back in and do the marketing because they were just not going to do it. Today, it's totally different. Rick did a tremendous job of showing his level of understanding. And it's changed since COVID. That's all changed. And the companies who will figure it out will do it, and the companies who don't will not. So it's interesting. There's all kinds of interesting stories about marketing and how it's changed. And I hadn't thought as much about the impact of COVID on how it really took that chapter that was number 7 or 8 on our audit list, and all of a sudden moved it up to number 2 or 3 in our audit list. And now I realize what that really came from. And it also helps that, as Rick said, that the technology has changed a lot to give us the information we need to do a better job of marketing. So that's another nugget that we pulled out of the Rick podcast that I hope people listen to, because it's a tremendous part of where we're going in our industry.
Absolutely. And as someone who's new to the parking industry, when Rick said that stuff about marketing, I thought, okay, I'm going to keep my eye on Reimagine over the next 3 to 5 years and see how they market. Maybe, I don't really understand what good marketing looks like in our industry, but I think if I keep my eyes on them, I will get an example of how that can be done. Something else that Rick talked a lot about was he said these things as a trio, which made me think they're sort of his mantra. That might be wrong, but that's how he presented it. He talked a lot about electrification, personalization, specifically with navigation, and digitization. And I personally really appreciated his forward thinking dreams of how navigation will come into the garage as technology develops. I thought that part was very interesting.
Okay, so I wanted to write those 3 down so I don't get lost.
They're hard to say out loud. I'm going to have to practice.
Right. Well, first of all, electrification, you and I were talking about that just a little while ago. Rick spent a lot of time talking about electrification because he, with the millennial garages, I think he understood the challenges and didn't go into it as a sales pitch. The parking companies have all run out there and this was COVID. Electrification may have started a little bit before COVID, but as it moved through COVID, it took on a new level because it was something they could sell. When the revenue's down to the bottom and you're trying to figure out how to let your client know you have a purpose here, that was one of the things that the parking companies jumped to and all went out and made relationships with the different EV companies and started to change it as a sales pitch that you put more EVs in your garages to make more money without thinking about the power requirements, the real utilization that you and I were just talking about, of the power requirements that Rick was talking a lot about because it's such a big part of this. And so there were, and it's just like when you see people running out there trying to sell something that hasn't been around much, you got to look at the details. And Rick looked at the details. He looked at the details. He understood, I've got challenges. Number one, there's not enough power. We can't get enough power to put in a zillion charging stations. Number two, there's probably not enough utilization, but we want to be sure that we get ahead of it. And so he did put in enough to get ahead of the utilization curve and to start working on the power requirements to be able to support it. So Rick really looked at this as a challenge more than a sales pitch. So when you put that into the hands of a good manager, they think through the challenges and start figuring out how to solve them. And when it goes in the hands of salespeople, they don't. They're just selling a product. And they didn't understand the other challenge that Rick solved because it was early stages and he knew how to solve it early stages. You put all this stuff in and now you got another management requirement on your staff. And so if you're going to try to sell it as a moneymaker, which Rick didn't, he understood it as a service and getting ahead of a new technology. When you start selling something like that as a moneymaker, you got to figure out what the management challenges are. And I don't think that was done. I know because we took a lot of look at what was happening in the EV market too, to start preparing for how we put that into our audits. And you can tell that this just wasn't, the understanding of how this was going to be managed was just not there. So Rick did it. He understood what was going to be the challenges and he did it. So moving on to the personalization and navigation. The navigation part is something that Rick had gotten involved in pretty early. And it's coming. There were already, I think some of the engineering companies have already been hired to go out there and do the geographic coordinates of every parking space in some garages they were hired to do. Because cars are going to be able to navigate to a space, not just to get you to the garage, but to get you inside the garage and into a parking space. So there's a lot being looked at the navigation once you pass the entrance to get you to a parking space, to take handicapped people to the parking space over by the elevators and to the spaces that are reserved for uh, that type of service, to get you to the empty spaces or to get you to your reserved space or to a reserved area. That's all coming, and it's one of those things that the back end work is starting to be done on it, and all of a sudden tomorrow everybody's going to say, "Well, have you done this to your garage?" And you're going to say no. But Rick's out there ahead of it because he knows it's coming, and he knows that there's going to be a certain level of people that are going to, all of a sudden, 2 years from now, 3 years from now, they're going to expect it to be in their garage. So it's again, and I think this probably can be paired back to COVID. We've always had the customer. We never had the ability to communicate with them. The internet, cell phones have moved that around. Well, now we have to be much better understand that we have an educated customer who's expecting you to talk to them. And Rick on the podcast understands that this communication with the customer is something you better get ahead of, because they're going to start asking you questions and you might want to be able to answer. So Rick's ahead of that, and he really understands it. And the navigation part of it is very interesting, because Rick's probably the only person in the parking industry that I've talked to that I think even talks about the navigation piece of it and the personalization piece, but understands it too. So that was terribly interesting when he brought that up in the conversation, because
And he spoke of it so well and so fluid. I felt like I really understood and even had a vision of what that time will be like.
Yeah, and it's coming faster than you think. It was about a year ago, really, that I heard that some of the engineering companies were out there doing the GPS coordinates of individual parking spaces, garages. I can't believe that's here, but here we are, and we do have to start getting ready for it. Digitization is something that Rick certainly understood extremely well, and it's something that we deal with a lot too, but he certainly understands it. And I can tell that he's in the lead on the understanding of how digitization is going to fully impact our industry. It's something that is a podcast in and of it. Each one of those subjects are probably podcasts in and of themselves. Digitization certainly is. And it's, Rick understands it because he's been outside the industry looking in, inside the industry looking out, outside the industry again looking in. He understands the importance of where this is going. I think from the sales aspect, I don't believe they fully understand where this is going, other than it's going somewhere, and they have to get in front of it. But the publication of all of the information that a customer wants, an owner wants, we want, that information is out there now and starting to be used more to be able to plan parking, look into the future with parking. And so digitization is going to play a tremendous role in the future. And to bring up a subject that you and I are very close to, how digitization is going to protect us. We know about all the people that are trying to attack the parking industry, and they're creating their own values. And if you research every time they present something, they're wrong. They're activists looking to create a narrative. But we're going to have to use the information we have to be able to produce the counter to that. Because as we just saw in a city that we were in just recently, it's had an impact. Their numbers, their belief of what they say, some city has believed them, and it's had an impact. Had an impact on the garages we were looking at, no question about it. So, and as we were riding around the city of San Francisco, how many empty parking spaces did you see on street? None. They were jam full of cars, because there's been this tremendous impact of trying to remove parking, create smaller numbers of parking to push people to the mass transit. That I'm not sure after COVID people are going to run to jump on the same BART system that I jumped onto in 2019 before COVID, when I jumped onto BART coming from Oakland over to San Francisco, and I couldn't even turn. I was squeezed in there. I'm not jumping back on that BART trained anymore. And I don't think most people are either. So we've taken parking spaces away that now we need more than ever before as we finish up the recovery of this. So that's my answer to Rick's 3 challenges. Challenges to the parking industry. If you don't know these things and you're trying to manage parking, if you don't start understanding them, you're going to be left behind. Electrification, personalization, is that how it was said, with navigation and digitization.
Just all the shuns
Yes,
is coming soon.
are coming. Right. And they were not really in our parking vocabulary 10 years ago.
So something about digitization that is exciting to me as an auditor is when the technology arrives and gets implemented in the majority of garages on data inside the facility, like which spaces are being used, how quickly are they turning over. I wonder if could that data be used to drive the legislation that mandates the parking in our cities? Could it be used to say, this is the information, could we adjust expectations in a way that the people who actually need to park can get the parking that they need?
Well, that's a great question, and you're not going to like my answer.
How exciting. This is a great podcast, guys.
The answer to that is we haven't done anything to take all of this information that we're starting to gather, put it in a format that really shows the demand in different cities, different places, and take that and put that in front of the government people who need that information. Instead, we have one of our parking industry, IPM, I'm going to say the name, IPMI, read their magazine and they talk about it all the time. It has been a lot over the last 2 years about the reduction in parking. Bicycles are going crazy, which you and I both know that we haven't found one yet. One of the other ones, PIE, just or Parking Today, just mentioned a big article about the change in about driving habits and the number of people that are injured and caused by those terrible cars. The people that we have on the forefront of our industry that are the ones that can go to the government, IPMI's offices in Washington, D.C., because they're supposed to be an arbiter for us. And there again, they're not. They're publishing the papers from the people we were just talking about. So we have a totally issue here that we somehow, and maybe it's us, have to get in front of, because the ability to communicate that to the government people who make those decisions are not doing it. Absolutely not doing it. So we have a bigger problem that's sitting back here looming, and you and I have kind of been attacking it through some of our articles and stuff, but that's not enough. It's just not enough. I'm seeing the newspaper articles all the time. I have one sitting over here on the desk to my right that was written about Houston, and I see them all the time. And I see the YouTube podcasts discussing those horrible parking spaces all the time. And then we were just in a city just recently, you and I, and we saw the results. The information that came out in the paper that you guys passed around and that we all saw about the city of Santa Monica increasing their parking tax, that was all about that issue.
Oh, yeah.
And go to downtown Santa Monica and try to find a parking space on Pacific Avenue tonight. I bet you can't. Yet they're tearing down garages, and because they tore down, we did a parking study on Garage 3 2.5 years ago, and they tore it down anyway, and gave the totally false idea that they were doing it for affordable housing. Well, it's still empty. They tore it down 2.5, almost 3 years ago. It's still just linked up and covered over. So there's no affordable housing going in there. In the middle of downtown of the most expensive city in the country, I'm not sure how good that's going to be for the affordable housing. So that's going on. I'm sorry we didn't mean to interfere with the discussion of Rick's podcast, but that's a very big industry, or a very big problem in our industry. We're not, the people who we think are in charge of getting that information out are not doing it. And we're going to have to come up with another way to do it, because if not, look at what we just saw in the last month, and it's going to get worse. So anyway, obviously, that's another subject that gets me fired up, and is probably another podcast.
Clyde, you are a very knowledgeable and passionate man, and we are grateful for you. So, two things about Rick's interview that surprised me. He got to talking about his first 21 days at Reimagine, and I was surprised that he has really invested these 21 days in building relationships. And that's something that we talk about a lot, is if you put the people first, and if you remember that parking is about the people, not about the cars, then you're more likely to be successful. The second thing that surprised me, and then I want to hear your thoughts and if anything surprised you, he talked about how cities get a lot of money from tourism. So my question about that is, how can the parking industry capitalize on the fact that tourism generates a lot of revenue?
It's interesting that came up because, again, some of that is something that we just saw in some of the last audits we were doing as we were looking at this. And we were looking at how many parkers in these garages were one time. Because we had LPR, we could track them over time. And it was different than what I would have said we would see in the parking industry 10 years ago. Very different. So Rick's position was that tourism has really changed in urban America, and we're seeing the impacts of it in parking. And that's obviously true based on what we're seeing. It also goes back to adding to the challenge of marketing, because you're now marketing to a group of people that you may not really kind of know the route to you because they've been there 5 times. You may be marketing to a totally different group of people. So you're marketing also to a group of people who view the time they park and the rates that they pay totally differently than people who park there regularly or even occasionally. So it's a different, very, very different group of people that seem to be in some of these cities. We've done audits now that have been basically coast to coast to coast, and we're seeing some of the same trends of that across all of these locations that we're doing. So tourism, or a change, and I think there's really 2 pieces to that. Tourism has certainly changed. I think Rick also made another great point when he said, when he and I started in the parking business, parking was really downtown. We really focused on downtown parking. Today, it's expanded so much. The verticals are airports, hospitals, universities have migrated into something that we have to manage now. There really weren't that big of a management challenge or even involved in it in the 1960s and 70s. And then as we crept into the 80s, I think we began to see some changes. But it's a population issue. Parking is really all about control of a space. So as the population increases, then the need for parking increases. It's to the owners out there. We think it is because we deal with the money side of it. It really doesn't have very much to do with making money. Parking has everything to do with control. I need you to control my damn parking spaces, because if I don't, I got a doctor over here that's mad as hell because the nurse over here is parking in her parking space. This was in probably 91, maybe 92. And I'll mention the name of the hospital because it's so long ago, I don't think they'll care. We were taking over parking in Memphis at I can't even remember the name of the hospital now. And that was the local hospital in Memphis, the one where Elvis went to. So it was a big thing to me. So we're taking over the hospital. Well, this hospital had a garage that was down the road a little bit. In between that garage and the hospital entrance was a big surface lot, primarily for patients. Nobody was controlling it. The night shift, the overnight nurses we're not parking in that darn garage down there. We're parking right here. So they would fill the lot. So when they were getting off, the day shift came in and filled that lot. So the patients couldn't park there. And so we took it over just as the day before, 2 days before we're taking it over. I think it was actually the week before. The hospital administrator came to me and said, okay, we've got this all set up now. You, on Tuesday for 24 solid hours, are going to meet all of our shifts, and you're going to have to get up there and explain to them what you're doing.
Lucky you.
But as you can see from 1992, I still remember this really well.
Traumatized, huh?
So around the clock for every shift, I had to get up there and tell them, if you park in that lot, we're going to tow your car. There's a garage down there, and go down there and park, and you can't park here anymore. And most of them knew this was coming, and they were really very good about it, right? They knew it was coming. They knew they shouldn't be doing what they were doing. But we still had the one person that raised their hand and said, I just don't think I'm physically able to walk all the way from the garage up to here, right? So we also had I love telling the story. We also had the emergency lot. So the emergency room nurses had decided the parking in the emergency room lot was theirs. And I had to move them because we needed a place for the patients to park. And so I'm standing up with some of our staff in the area that they had given us for an office that was right across the street, kind of from the hospital. And I'm standing there in the middle of the first day of us doing this. And here comes this guy that's an orderly. And he walks up to me and says, "All right, you're Clyde Wilson?" I said, "Yes." He said, "The chief trauma nurse sent me up here to give you this." And it was a rubber glove and some ointment. Stick it.
Hospital humor hurt.
Yeah.
My goodness.
So I just told him, "Thank you, and tell her it'll be well used." So, those that we went through the growing pains of this, but it was really about control. It wasn't for the hospital in Memphis. It wasn't about making money. It was about keep everybody parking where they're supposed to park. So as the parking industry moved out of downtown, where this was all about making money because it was mostly leases, we moved into a different world of parking for control. But we kind of took the making money attitude with us, and it took a little bit of time for that to go away. But Rick really understood that move because he came out of New York, and that was all about making money. Still is today. They didn't give a crap about the building that was above them. This was about making money in the garage down below because you were paying rent for it. So Rick has a tremendous understanding of that, and it was interesting. I thought that he brought that up because it was really a very important transition point in the industry, and he understands it, and it's still impacting us today very much. Not everybody understands how big of an impact that move from just managing parking in a city to when we moved out away from that, how much that changed our business. So Rick dies. That was part of the great conversation, because there are a lot of guys in the parking business out there we could have a conversation with that would also understand all of those things. But most of them were either auditing or causing problems too. And so we don't have conversations. But Rick, a guy that I've known totally differently over the years. And so it was interesting that he brought all that stuff up because it was all very important stuff, very important individual pieces of this very complicated industry. So I thought it was very interesting. He covered a lot of ground and has a tremendous understanding of the industry, slightly differently than the typical parking operators do because he's been inside and outside of it. So it was interesting. You have any more questions?
No, and our time is about up. Thanks for hanging in there, audience, and for listening all the way to the end. As you can tell, Clyde and I just really enjoyed our time with Rick. If you haven't listened to that podcast, I do recommend that you back up an episode and take that in on your next commute because it is really jam-packed, full of good information. The last thing that I took from the episode has more to do with being a human and less to do with being in the parking industry. But Rick said that he focuses on his 3 big things so that he doesn't stumble. And he said that in the context of when you're doing a really hard thing, if you try to focus on everything, it is not going to go well. So pick the 3 things that matter the most to you and focus on those, and everything else will probably work itself out. I hope that you guys have a great rest of your morning, afternoon, or evening, wherever you are. Thanks for joining us on our Parking Industry Podcast, and have a great day.
To quote one of the greatest business minds of our time, Charles Munger, he said, "The best thing a human can do is help another human being know more." Here on our Parking Industry Podcast, we want to provide knowledge and resources. If you heard something that sparked your curiosity in today's episode, please reach out on our socials at TPN Consulting. You can find us on LinkedIn, Facebook, YouTube, and Instagram. Don't forget to subscribe and follow. See you next time on our Parking Industry.